Okay. Let's see. I don't see Anil or Venkata here.
Is there, I mean, who recently helped? Was it John that was doing the sale operator? Is that
Yeah, I mean, they have the same issues, really. Basically, it's like Lynn and I just kind of ad hoc do things manually that people ask about. We could probably, I mean, we manage the Istio org through the Git config. There's no reason we can't add the Istio ecosystem there as well, if that's solving the problem that people have. I'm not sure if that is exactly what I'm not sure what the problem is here. I'm assuming that they don't know how to do things, or they don't like pinging me and Lynn. So I don't know, adding new repos is something that we are going to make easy to do for people. Or if they really just want clarification, then the current answer is just ask Lynn or me over Slack or something.
is there anything special that you guys did above and beyond for that sale operator repo?
No, not really. We just added people and set up the repo, gave them the permissions. Yeah. Okay, yeah, without more context on what they're looking for, I think we can just say, here's the current state, and if someone wants to improve it, here's how you could do it. That seems reasonable.
Sounds like a good answer to me. And then looks like Whitney's up next.
Hi, everyone. I think by now everyone knows about the release channel proposal, and this is a major change in Istio. So I was told that I need TOC approval for it. So I'm really hoping that we can get this approved. Based on everyone in the TOC's feedback, it seems like it's good to go. It's just for us to get like an official approval and for folks to like tick off next to the approvals and officially say this is something that we have accepted in Istio. Is there, I guess the question to the room will be, is there anything that is preventing the TOC from approving this now? Cool. Can we assume it's approved?
I mean, I think we discussed a lot over Slack about how I was uncomfortable with adding a whole new CRD, and I chatted with some of the other folks in the TOC offline, and there was some agreement there.
I'm curious, that's more implementation issue. I'm wondering if that will block the actual approval of the RFC itself.
I think it is and isn't just an implementation detail. In my mind, it's kind of a more fundamental thing, and maybe this is just a weird way that my mind works, because even thinking about it, I'm not sure it makes sense. But in my mind, what is currently being proposed is like 2 split lanes, and as a user, you decide which lane to go into. And my worry with the project is that we have so many of those branches in the onboarding guide: ambient versus sidecars, gamma versus Istio, extended versus stable, Helm versus Istio cuddle. Like, there's a huge list. And in my experience, when listening to users adopt Istio, and myself even adopting other projects, the number of split choices to make is very, very challenging for adoption. Because when you're coming onto Istio for the first time, you have no idea which one you should make, right? feels like to me, if we make it instead that there's later an option that just says restrict features that I don't happen to like, to me that feels less like a split decision and more like an incremental feature. Just like you could later say, I want to turn on strict MTLS. Like in the past, we used to have in the install docs 2 options. You would either install MTLS strict mode or install permissive mode. And we later changed it to you just install Istio. And if you want strict mode, you later say, I want strict mode. It's a subtle difference, but to me, it's actually pretty meaningful because I distinctly remember my first time going through the docs and I spent like 10 minutes staring at this MTLS or not MTLS. So I don't even know what MTLS is. The other thing as well is that it also moves the ownership of what is stable and not. If we do the CRD approach, it's very fixed. Like CRDs, there's this like, you don't want like 50 versions of CRDs, right? They're kind of a schema. If we move it to a restriction-based model, then it's a lot easier for modifications and tweaks, either by vendors or users. Like I worry that if we go down this approach, every TOC, we're going to have this big debate between all the different vendors that have that are using this, and like, well, my vendor wants to use field X, but the other vendor doesn't want to. Like, is it stable? Is it not stable? And we just spend all of our time arguing over what is and what isn't stable. If we allow there to be modifications easily made, then we don't have to have those debates, right? One vendor can say, hey, we use envoy filter, that's fine. Another can say we don't want to, and a third can maybe say we do, but only these certain fields, right? It's very easy to tweak and extend and modify.
So John, I think if it sounds like maybe you're proposing that we decouple the idea of API maturity from which APIs are enabled for a given platform. Is that?
Yeah, sorry,
right?
maybe I only talked about this in private thread, so maybe I should explain what what I was proposing instead, if that helps. So what we have today is 2 different CRDs that are generating with different schemas. Largely, this is to remove fields or even entire APIs. What I was suggesting instead is that we have just one CRD, which is the current ones, but then on top of that, we can add validation that can reject certain fields or even entire APIs. So Kubernetes provides a way to do that now without webhooks with the cell expression. We call it like a validating admission policy, I think. And so you can have a policy that's called like Istio strict mode or stable or whatever you want to call it, that says if field foo.bar.banana is set, deny. If this other field set, deny. If this field set, deny. And so we can just list out all the fields that we declare as extended and then deny them. And we could arrange this in different ways. Like we could have one giant policy for every API and block them all. We could have one per API. This doesn't really matter. It's all the same to the user in the end. And that way it's easier to extend or tweak or modify as well. It kind of sits on top of the CRD. So we're not changing the definition of the API. We're just changing what is allowed usage of the API.
So I think that a validating admission policy, can you folks hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
It's a little quiet.
Let me see if I can turn on my, oh, okay, so. Better? Is that better at all?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I'm definitely on board with the idea of a validating admission policy. I think that like in general, I think that's a really good thing for Istio to have. But I think that, John, your proposal where you're wanting to decouple the maturity from the enablement, I think that that's actually coupling things for the user. I think it's actually coupling those 2 together. So I think it's useful for the Istio community, for the TOC at the end of the day, to be able to say, these are the features that have met a certain threshold. I don't think our users are in a position to make that decision. Like if you're concerned with stability as a user, then and making sure the API is going to be in the project for a long time, making sure it's got certain testing, that's not a user's not equipped to be able to decide that. and nor should they, in my opinion. And I think that's where release channels, and we've seen this with Gateway API and other projects, be the body that decides what is stable and what is not, what's extended in the proposal. And I think CRDs give that, because with the policy, you can you can just reapply the CRD itself. You can go with the extended CRD and apply it, and it's not gonna block anything. Well, I guess if with a policy, you're still blocking the usage of that field, so never mind. But regardless, I think that those are two different problems. And if a user wants to say, hey, I want to lock down these fields, they should be free to do that. And that's what a voting emission policy allows. But when it comes to the TOC, the community, Istio saying, here's what we recommend, here's what is stable enough for production and here's what's not, the release channels idea gives us that ability to write that the way that the VAP does not.
I feel like what you're saying, it makes sense, but I don't know that it applies to the scenario that Istio's in. First of all, the proposal is taking basically every single API except for 3 fields in telemetry and WASM and Envoy filter and saying that they're all stable. So we haven't really, it's quite different than Gateway API, where we started from everything was experimental and we only promoted things as stable that actually met a bar. We have prior art and we're not getting as much value out of having a split. The second thing is who was really the target audience? Let's not beat around the bush here. It's vendors that want to ship a subset of Istio that they can support, right? So why would vendors who are the target audience for this feature effectively want TOC to gate what features they need to support in their product? That's what I'm concerned about. I don't want to be the arbitrator of a bunch of different vendors who have different goals and infrastructure and requirements. And every TOC meeting is us debating whether a field is stable or not, or it should be removed from stable, when it's not even really about the stability, but it's about the goals of a product and their infrastructure.
And that's why I say it's a layered approach, right? So if a vendor wants to remove a field or add a field, they have the ability to fork and add a field to our CRD. They have the ability to add a policy that blocks a field. Vendors have other recourse besides the CRD. But on the other, sure, yes, the target audience the main audience for this feature is vendors. But a vendor might also want to be able to know, hey, how much, to have the community sign off on a thing. And just to be completely clear here, at Microsoft, we like policies. We like to be able to see, hey, we're going to support Kubernetes for this many releases. We want to see how, what does the community say we're going to support? What does the community say is supported for a number of releases? And so this is what we've done with Kubernetes, what we've done with all the open source projects that we tend to support on the platform. And so we, months ago when we started, looking at Istio and adopting Istio in our products, we looked at Istio and we said, okay, what's the stable subset? What is good and what is not? And it's to your point, John, it's really hard to tell because the API groups don't mean much. There's a lot of history there. And so the release channel's work is really an attempt to try to draw some lines in the sand. Is there tech debt we have to eat by promoting certain virtual service, et cetera, to stable? Yes. That's kind of part of Whitney's proposal here. But in discussing this for the months that we have, I feel like there's been consensus, documented consensus, that trying to remove anything from virtual service destination rule, et cetera, is not going to, it's just not going to happen. And so, yes, I think vendors should have the ability to turn things on and off, but I think that the Istio project should be able to be more authoritative on what is stable and what is not.
So if the goal really is just to know what set of things is stable, as in not going to break or be removed, or the project is committed to it, then why do we need to push that onto the user? Is it not just enough to label fields and say, these are the ones the project is committed to? Or maybe we don't even need to, and we just have a more broad policy, but we'll say label them because we already have the new label. And then the vendors can do with that as they please. The issue I'm specifically worried about is the complexity this pushes onto users. From a management side of field labeling and stuff, I think that's fine, and we can do all sorts of tooling and work there. But I don't want to push something that's not actually solving the problems we're trying to solve and is actually increasing the complexity of the product.
It seems like this is providing a gating mechanism because we've historically been pretty sloppy about what is considered stable versus alpha, beta, all of that. And so then this provides sort of a gating mechanism to prevent people from getting into trouble. I think if we were a little bit more, had been a little bit more disciplined and could be more disciplined going forward, it seems like the channel may not be necessary if the actual labels applying to these APIs was actually meaningful. But the problem seems to be that it's not meaningful. And so this provides a mechanism to keep users from getting into trouble because documentation isn't sufficient.
But we've already said every field is stable, basically. So what value are we getting?
I'm not actually, no, just to be clear, I wasn't necessarily advocating for this. I was saying, though, I think if we might not need this if we could be more disciplined, if we can actually promise the users going forward that, these things that we're promoting to V1 are the actual stable feature set and try to get people off of alpha.
Yeah, I think the thing that's maybe confusing is there is a difference between stable and good. Istio has a lot of APIs that are stable in the fact that they're not going to change or break, but they're also not good APIs in the sense that we don't like them or they have issues or they're hard to understand or they have better replacements. Like Istio is not going to make breaking changes to largely any of its APIs. Maybe
but users don't. But that's my point is that users don't know that. Like they.
Yeah, but we've now promoted everything in the last release. We've promoted every single API to V1 basically. So that seems like a solved problem.
Not every single API though. Look, we promoted the ones that are de facto.
We ignored two
not
APIs,
possible to
right?
change.
Envoy filter and WASM. WASM is legitimately unstable, and Envoy filter is permanently unstable. So that's an exception,
right? And then telemetry API is kind of the testing ground for being able to add certain fields. And then moving forward, that's the other piece that I don't think is being considered. Moving forward, like for example, I saw that there. WASM fund is a bad example, but like for example, if we added a new field to auth policy or a new field to virtual service, that field starts off as experimental. It gives us that ability to be able to gradually not experimental. It starts off as extended and can, go through the stable when the time comes. Like we don't have anything like that today, and it's a forcing function to actually consider these things to and check their promotion. We have no the enhancements repo in Istio is effectively dead, despite several attempts to backfill it, because there's just simply no forcing function to actually go back and make those changes. And if there's no forcing function, people aren't going to do it, and that's been demonstrated.
Me or so my personal opinion on adding validation, I'm not against it, and admission control, whatever you want to do, John. But my concern is, existing Istio APIs are what they are. I don't think we can expect too much changes. It's a mess, and adding individual fields will just make the mess a bit bigger because as a user, I'll never know if I deploy on vendor 1 or vendor 2 or whatever I get, because some fields may work, some fields may not work. I'll get, Helm charts being rejected because a particular field I'm using is not going to work. So overall, I'm not sure. It is a good idea to have the validation as a mechanism, but I think it will take the mess we have. We doubled it with the release channels, and then we multiply it by 10 with individual field policies. As a user, I'll find it very, very, very hard to use it, which maybe it's a feature because that will mean they need to look at the gateway API and look at a better API surface where, the more discipline has been used from the start, and we're not trying to kind of have this kind of disjoint mode where everything experimental is promoted to V1, but now we take field out. And so my personal opinion is add it. I'm +1 to add this validation mechanism, but we should steer users toward the gateway API, and we should have a better approach for the gateway API mode APIs where we follow the same model with the upstream gateway where we have clear. I'm talking about proper gateway API vendor extensions instead of take all of these Istio APIs and put a label selector and automatically they become V1 gateway extensions. So if we can, moving forward, when the gateway API surface follow discipline and take a better approach with proper APIs, whatever we do in Istio doesn't change much, because at the end of the day, users use what they use, and we cannot impact this because we made bad mistakes and they cannot be fixed at this point. That makes sense?
I guess that's my underlying / overall question is, over the 6 to 8 months that myself, Whitney, other folks from Microsoft have been trying to work towards something better, there's been a lot of resistance to any change in process, adding new forcing functions, etc. And at the end of the day, like the continued feedback we seem to hear, even after folks are interested or even excited by a couple of their proposals, the overall feedback we get is, it's broken, it's not going to be fixed. But it doesn't feel like anybody's interested in fixing it with current stuff. Is that a decent summary?
I think it's half correct in the sense that I mean, we are all excited about fixing things. I'm 100% agreeing with you that we need to do better and to have stability. On the other side, the approach we took, which is take everything and just replace beta with V1 and treat it as stable, it's, superficially, yes, they are V1 APIs now, and they are stable because you declare them stable. And as John said, they are as good as they were 1 year ago, and they are not going to change because we cannot make any backward incompatible change in practice. So whatever we do, we are forced by users to maintain backward compatibility with what they use today. The only part I personally see out of this is new API surface and discipline on the new stuff that we are adding. If you think we can, remove, we removed one API and a couple of fields. And even that is likely to create some problems down. Okay. I don't know how we can practically approach this with the existing API surface.
Go ahead, Mitch.
Okay, sorry, I can't see the queue. I'm on mobile. If it is the case, and I agree that it's the case, that there are APIs that we practically cannot change and must support for the foreseeable future because of the breadth of their adoption, what is the case for not marking those APIs as stable?
I don't think there is one, or I hope not, because we already did it in this release. I think everyone's on board with that, right? Well, I don't know if you can see the comments, Mitch, but people seem to be agreeing.
Thank you.
And kind of going on that point, what I was going to say is, in my mind, what we're talking about is very similar to how Kubernetes handled things like replication controller and ingress. Like they're V1, they're stable, they don't have breaking changes, but they're not good APIs, and they've been increasingly made obsolete. Replication controller is totally dead. It's totally replaced by deployment and other things. Ingress is a bit less far on that path, but it's basically replaced by gateway API, right? I don't see a fix to our APIs aside from making them obsolete by having a better alternative. And I don't mean the Google way, where you say it's deprecated before the replacement's ready, but by keeping it totally fine and stable and working, and just making something that's so much better that everyone adopts it and push people there by documentation, examples, etc., which is somewhat underway with the Gateway API. It doesn't cover everything, of course. I don't think making like a new telemetry API at this point would be valuable either. But I don't see really what else we can do. Go ahead, Keith.
I think so. You said something interesting, which is the work is somewhat along the way with Gateway API, and as well as I do that progress there is really slow. Like from a user perspective, progress on new fields and capabilities and replacements in the Gateway API, and even in open telemetry for that matter, progress there is really slow because they're working across multiple data plane implementations. And so there's going to be less innovation there. I don't think that we are yet, the virtual service destination APIs, et cetera, are yet in that ingress spot, because or replication controller for that matter. We're not in that case because virtual service is continuing to improve. Our authorization policy is continuing to improve. Users are still wanting functionality, and it's not, and we don't have a really good reason for not giving it to them, except for trying to wait for something that's coming down the line, which is too slow for them. And so really, I view it more as we have two competing standards. And for newer users, it's clear, it's relatively clear. I'll say newer users and basic users, it's relatively clear which one should be used, and we should make that clearer. But for users with anything moderately complex, they don't really have a choice. And so I don't think that we can yet say, oh, the only thing we're waiting for to make the APIs obsolete, because for the more complex users and for Istio users, that's a relatively large and important percentage of Istio users. There's not a replacement ready yet. And so I don't know that it's wise to make decisions based on that assumption. If we were 4 years down the line, then maybe, but we're not there yet. And so, you know, the idea of, you know, we did promote the networking APIs to stable, you're off into stable, because that reflects where we are today. That's the first step. Any process that we innovate on has to represent where we are today. I think the hope behind the, and Whitney can speak more in detail here since she wrote the proposal. I think the hope behind the release channels proposal is that moving forward with new API surface on these existing stable APIs, we can inject more discipline. And leaving it up to vendors, I don't think solves that problem from a community perspective. If we have a validating admission policy, we still have arbitrary decisions that are being made. Why not make them with CRDs?
I was going to add that I still view this as implementation details because at the core of it is for the TOC to decide if we do want to dictate what is stable versus extended. And I feel whether we go with the CRD approach or the validating admission policy approach, we will still end up in the position of presenting a stable version versus an extended version. And I'm not sure what is like our stance on, do we want to have this prescriptive approach of saying what is stable?
In my opinion, part of why, and I didn't really say this, but part of why I like the approach is that I don't really believe that the vendors are going to want a unified view of what is allowed and what isn't long term. In fact, both of the vendors I know that are interested in this have both told me that they're going to make their own tweaks to it because they need to allow extra things or deny extra things. So I'm pretty confused why we want a centralized approach to this. Like that's been my concern with this proposal the whole time, is I have a very unclear mapping of what we're trying to get out of this proposal to what we're actually doing. It seems to me like our goal for users is they should be able to know which APIs they should use without confusion and without accidentally making the wrong choice. I feel like we have a pretty clear flowchart now with this. And I feel like the goal for vendors is to be able to add whatever restrictions they want on the API service to meet their needs, which we can do with validating policy. I honestly don't even think it has to be in Istio core. I don't mind it there because it's kind of a lightweight thing off to its side, but it seems like it could just as easily be something that is done on a per vendor basis. And maybe we just have a pattern for how it can be done for a kind of consistent experience for users.
So, I'm trying to put my hand up. Go ahead, Mitch.
Go ahead, Louis. You can go first.
So it seems like we have 3 different problems we're trying to solve, right? There's vendors who are going to choose to support things. Well, they can only not support things that are in the API. That's the only choice that they can make, right? Right, they can choose to support it or not support it. Then there's API evolution. Right? How do we as a project define and maintain APIs in a way that allows for API survivability and also the ability to make mistakes? Right, we propose a field, we try it out, it gets into a CRD, and then we realize we made a mistake and we need to undo that. And now I've lost my train of thought. But there's definitely a split between the responsibilities of the Istio project and the responsibilities of vendors. The Istio project is responsible for its APIs, right? So we here, right, get to constrain that, right? Vendors, if they want to have their own APIs, can have their own vendor APIs, right? And the gateway API makes that much easier to do nowadays. So I expect that is how vendors will gain a lot of flexibility. And then there's a question of mechanism, right? Is channel, is validation, is versioning the right mechanism to facilitate API evolution? And then what we have done is just basically, accepted all of our existing API debt and put it into stable, right? And we're trying to define a new process for those APIs going forward. It's still somewhat orthogonal to the gateway API stuff, Custom. Like we're going to have both the old Istio APIs and the gateway APIs being stable. People are absolutely free to make recommendations about which APIs to use, and the project will do that as well over time. But it's still somewhat orthogonal to the problems. And then, we have to be cognizant of the too many options problem that John described. So one question, right? Do we have an idea which approach is better for API evolution? Right, the approaches that we see today are multiple CRDs, right? Like version CRDs, or unversioned CRDs with a field-by-field stability guarantee. The gateway API mixes both of these things. Right, the stability guarantee of extended versus not isn't all that meaningfully different to the user of a stability guarantee of V1 alpha 1 versus V1. Right, because for most users that just means, will it work or will it not work when I try to use that field? In Istio, we've historically used CRD versioning. The gateway API is not entirely doing that anymore. Do we have an idea which one of those is actually going to be better for us to use? The proposal is proposing two CRDs, right? An alpha, an extended, an unstable and a stable, effectively. The reason why to use two CRDs is if we want to remove a field before it progresses to stable, we can do that without ever having schema deprecation occur in the stable API. The alternative, right, a validation-based approach is to say, well, we can deprecate fields in a stable API. They will eventually retire, but that's the way that we deal with stability, right? And we can put a validation on them if we want to prevent people from using them. And so users would opt into basically an API profile that says, am I allowed to use deprecated features or not? Right, that's the technical choice that we're deciding on.
Yeah,
How is that going? How is that going in the gateway API?
There's some growing pains a lot. They're doing the first promotion of an API from extended to stable, and I don't think they've figured out how it's going to work yet. One challenge that we have that I don't think is that we've said that we're making extended, which is what we couldn't do, which means that we can't actually make breaking changes in extended, right? We don't want to destabilize the default option. So in terms of API evolution, I don't think we're doing as good of a job at solving that with this approach. It seems to me what you need to have the ability to make mistakes is to have something where it's totally an experimental playground. Like in Kubernetes, for example, alpha features are like this big blocked off thing that to use on any vendor, you basically have to go provision like an ephemeral playground cluster that's going to get deleted. That's like the type of thing we would need in order to be able to make just arbitrary breaking changes. Like no one can go run an API that's going to make breaking changes every release in production, right? And we shouldn't encourage that.
Like Kubernetes is in a privileged position to do that, John, right?
Sure, but I'm not going to go tell users, here's a version of Istio that's less than today. Every version is going to make breaking API changes, and like you can't upgrade basically. And go run this in real world, not just in test for prototyping, trying out new fields.
Right. I think Kubernetes struggles with that on the other end, though, right? Like they don't get enough adoption of alpha features because nobody's willing to do that, so they don't get tested.
Yeah. So it's tough because you have, if it's too much experimentation is allowed, then it's too unstable for users to try, and if it's too stable, then there's not enough experimentation allowed, right?
So just like focusing on the mechanism for a moment. Right. We've had lots of experience with multiple versions of CRDs. We've never actually removed a field from a CRD. Well, no, that's not true. We have removed them during promotion, right? We haven't promoted some. We're going to have to deal with extended and non-extended things in Gateway anyway, right? And eventually deprecation. So we're going to need machinery to do that in a standard way. I haven't actually built any of that yet, right? Like there's just code to do status. Right, but there's nothing that's going to reject right now an extended field usage of the Gateway API, right? We haven't done any of that work. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong.
I think what happens is by default, Kubernetes will ignore unknown fields. And so even within Gateway API, and I think Whitney's proposal does similar, removing of a field should be safe. It'll just be pruned.
No, but an extended key, right? That's not an unknown field. That's a well-known field in a version of the API that somebody does or does not support.
Oh, I thought you were saying removal of a field in extended during the promotion.
Oh, like yes, but right, even ignoring removal, right? We don't have machinery today to handle extended in a validating synchronous way.
Ah, yes, correct.
And that's already a problem, right? And it's a problem we're going to see more of going forward. It's tough, right? I don't expect to see a lot of evolution of the APIs that we have just promoted, except, right, of the APIs that Istio has that are not. That's basically the disjoint set of Istio APIs and the Gateway APIs, right? Which mostly means the telemetry API, the authorization policy API, maybe the WASM API at some point if it becomes stable, and eventually some other leaf policy objects that do some things that are not covered by the Gateway API. But right now, I think we're mostly talking about 3 APIs, right? That will be stable Istio APIs that are used with the either stable or extended flavor of the Gateway API.
Plus added fields to new API surface for the stable APIs.
Sorry, which stable APIs? The Gateway ones or the Istio ones?
The Istio ones. So, for example,
right, yes, three APIs.
Like, you said authorization policy, telemetry, and WASM.
Would be the 3 I would expect.
But like, say, like for example, somebody's wanting a new H2 field to be configured in virtual service. Like there's just one added for like max concurrent streams in the last release. That's also a scenario where the CRD approach, or the emission policy approach, for that matter, you would need to be able to say, hey, through this new field on the stable API is not stable. That's also unsolved.
Right. Yeah, I'm just saying that's almost the same problem as saying that extended field is supported or unsupported.
Yes, but it's not just the 3 APIs; it's the entire API service. It's because you're adding in new fields.
Sure. Cool. So my sense was just on the mechanism, right? if the way that the users get exposed to supported or unsupported things varies wildly, it'll be quite frustrating for them. And so I was trying to assess whether we have an overall preference for the extended or unsupported field via admission control on a uniformly single versioned resource, or multiple CRD types, as well as extended field support or non-support via admission control, because of what the Gateway API is doing. How do we think users are going to react to that?
Mitch and Costin have hands. I want to let them go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, mine's stale. I'll take it down.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Costin. Get a response to that.
So, I mean, I mentioned in the chat, I think both approaches are part of the solution. I don't think either is bad. Gateway API is following the same model, so there is no harm in being consistent with what they are doing. But we need to be careful and not take kind of a blind approach of saying all or nothing, or kind of try to overdo on each direction. It's very useful to know that all the current APIs are V1. We have the stable channels. That's settled. It's okay. If we can also freeze it and try to not add more stuff, that's even better, because we avoid the problem of having to use admission. And I think at some point we have to go back into we cannot ever create any new CRD and look at what other projects, CRD is defined by other projects if we don't want to define our own, or define some new CRDs and, not 100, but maybe 2 or 3 at a time are viable in the extended channel, and use a mix of all solutions that are available. I mean, new CRDs, new fields with admission controller, and the stable versus the extended channel. We don't have to pick one, but we need to pick the right one for each API and do the hard work for each API, basically.
I guess the choice here, Costin, is between, once we have a version of an API that we have brought to stable, does all revision to that API occur via the extended or non-extended mechanism? So it occurs in place, right in the version? Or
that's not possible that we know. I mean, we know that's not possible. I mean, we need to have at least one CRD. I mean, if we don't have 2 differently named CRDs, we'll never be able to make changes, because and we'll still have the pressure to keep exactly the same fields and just rename fields or do hacks, basically.
Well, no. I mean, both Whitney's proposal, right, says, look, we have an unstable and a stable version of the same named resource, right? And then the unstable one is allowed to add fields. Not all those fields will get promoted to the stable version, right? So, like, you have the same problem anyway, Costin. Right?
Yeah.
You can't reuse a field name ever. The only thing you can do is deprecate until you have like a major version break, right? And so you're going to have like, V1 stable and V1 unstable. There is no field name reuse ever within that version. You don't ever create a new version like a V2 until you have a major structural change to the API. So the way the API evolves is you add fields, they get flagged. Admission control may reject them or accept them, but the actual schema evolution is very constrained within that version, right? Because if you want users to avoid toil, right? So they say, I need one of these alpha features. They're going to go into their existing CRD in production, and they're going to flip the version, right, in their YAML. That's all they're going to do, right? And so we're trying to keep the amount of toil that they have down. You can achieve the same effect with one version, one CRD type and a validator, right? They're logically the same thing. And then the only other thing you're discussing is for the whole API may be considered unstable. And so it actually gets a progression. But once it becomes stable, the only way its schema can evolve is via field level deprecation. Effectively, addition and deprecation. That's it. Until you go to a new major revision.
If I can answer quickly, so I think we are not probably in a situation where we are going to add a lot of fields to the existing API, to destination rule and all the other APIs that we have as V1. So if we have one particular field and it passes all the reviews, I completely agree with you. That the current approach is good. We add a field. Exactly what Whitney proposed is good for small changes and small extensions to the current API. But if we want to add a new feature or to, I don't know, start doing WASM or whatever, I don't think user switching completely is a solution. I mean, switching to the different channel and getting the entire command with all the behaviors and all the new APIs. So I think it's valuable to be able for the user to opt in an individual and takes the approach of defining new CRDs where the user doesn't have to worry about it, and then we have the flexibility or to either promote them as they are to V1 or to define a new named version. So basically case by case, but with minimizing the changes we do in the current API surface and try to define new features with new CRDs or by not defining any CRD and adopting other project CRDs that are stable.
I think what I'm getting a little bit lost by in the conversation is it sounds like all of these things are possible with traditional Kubernetes CRD versioning. I know that we've struggled with that in the past, and at times we've had to keep versions of the CRD identical, even though they had different version names. But it seems like those problems have been fixed upstream in Kubernetes. Louis, the solution that you're talking about, particularly where you're adding fields through a different version, does that require a release channel model? Or is this something, and I apologize if I've asked this question before.
A release channel is just an installation concept, right? If you're doing the validating admission control style, right, it just means install this form of a validating admission. If you're using a bunch of version CRDs, then you're saying install specific versions of them, right? That's just an installation artifact. It's a conceptual thing, right? Nothing about the API machinery itself has actually changed. It's right. We have to there are effectively two paradigms here, right? That Kubernetes API machinery will support either. We get to choose between them. As far as I can tell, and John, like, once we have a stable API, all we're doing is adding fields to it and saying what their support state is.
Yep.
When we have an unstable API, and I mean the entirety of the CRD, then, right, that entirety of the CRD can be in an alpha state, right? And that's a clear signal to users that the whole thing is unstable.
Yes.
Right. And those are the only two things that we ever do, really. We can vary the number of stable states like alpha, beta, GA.
Yeah.
We can vary the stable state of a field, deprecated, not deprecated, whatever it is maybe. And then we just write admission control policy against that, right, following one of the two idioms. I think we're just trying to decide, like, what I want to know is what's going to yield a better experience to users. So that, okay, we've taken all the APIs, we've made them stable, right, except for 2.5. Right, and the half means we already have to support field level stability reporting. And Gateway makes us do that too, right? So we're already committed to a roadmap where we have field level stability reporting and potentially field level admission control. Then there's this choice about schema evolution. If you want to consume a new field that already exists in a stable API. Sorry, there's a stable API for the feature you're consuming, and you want to consume an unstable thing about it. Do you A, switch the CRD version, or B, use the field and tell the admission control to stop rejecting it? That's the choice.
I think we should also consider the use case I mentioned in the chat, where the user, wants to have stable on 99% of the workloads, but has one workload that requires one of the new features or an experimental, or he just wants to test that this new experimental feature is working properly. And neither TRDs or admission controllers would allow the user to do that. I mean,
Admission control would allow the user to do that.
well,
You need a sophisticated admission controller, but you can at least
not
theoretically
cell-based, not cell-based.
not the
I think John is proposing. Yeah.
Not the built-in one. I agree with that.
Well, you kind of could, right? You could say this field is only allowed in this namespace.
Yeah, I suppose you could write a
Can
cell
you?
expression. Well, the user would have to tweak the cell expressions. We would have to provide machinery for it. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite an advanced case.
But at least logically, you could do a custom, right?
And it's not even necessarily
it's fine.
safe because one namespace using experimental field has the potential to impact the entire cluster by destabilizing it.
With the current API, but with Gateway API, where things are scoped and kind of well determined, it's not a problem.
Well, in theory, any use of experimental and control plane can blow it up. Like crashing is about up.
Sure.
But yeah.
But it's still better than the alternative, which is basically turning everything on because you have one workload that needs something you want to test.
Sure, I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, so what we're already committed to with the Gateway API, right? Like Istio is going to be very aggressive in terms of supporting as many features as possible in the Gateway API. I mean, I support probably every feature in the Gateway API, more or less. I don't know if we really have a problem with extended, but we may decide not to support something in the Gateway API at some point in the future, and we'll have admission control for it, right? Or status, I guess the other option, but like we'll end up doing fields level things.
Yeah, it will probably be status just because in the Gateway API, you can't tell on a route whether it's your implementation or not because of the indirection. But yes, I agree.
So Keith, coming back to your question about forcing functions, right? In the two worlds, right, where either whole APIs are unstable or stable, right? Like we say WASM is an unstable feature. So its API being unstable means, right, its API is in the V1 alpha or whatever we decide is the nomenclature. Then for the feature to progress to stable, its whole API must move to stable. Thereafter, anytime there's any incremental evolution, it's by fields level support and or deprecation on that stable API. And if you accumulate enough deprecation debt, maybe you create a new major version. Is that yielding the same forcing function thing that you are looking to achieve? It seems pretty rigid.
Are you with the actual CRD evolution instead of admission policy? Is that your question?
Yeah, so basically you have an unstable CRD. At some point there's a stable CRD, right? So that's CRD versioning, right? As we know and love it. Any change thereafter is field level stability evolution within the stable API. Right. Addition and deprecation. And then there must be a major watershed event to have a V2.
Correct.
That gives pretty strong forcing gates. But we also avoids, right? We don't ever say we're going to have like V1 alpha, like unstable, then stable, then V2. We don't really say, I mean, I guess we could do V2 unstable and then V2 stable.
Yes, that's technically how you would do it. But I think that is the forcing function that I'm personally looking for from a project governance perspective. Again, somewhat putting aside vendors here, I think telemetry API is a good example where on-by-filter was the way to do telemetry changes. And then we said, oh, use telemetry API now. And it was in alpha, and it's been in alpha. And it took, a lot of discussion and conversation to even figure out what fields are going to be promoted to stable in the latest PR. And we got some agreement on that, and the PR is merged. But with the release channel approach, telemetry API never gets put out there as, hey, migrate to this before getting to stable. That just would not happen because that forcing gate is there. And there is, it's in the extended channel, and we don't say there's a replacement until there's something in the stable channel, right? It creates a way for us to be able to create governance policy, project level policy around what is the way to do things in Istio. And sure, you could do validating admission policy, but users can easily manipulate that and change that in order to get what they want out of it, and it's not as clear a signal. We've had users on Azure trying to change our own, change our policies to try to get what they want out of it. Like, users are going to use whatever they can to fix their use case, because that's what a user should do. That's what a user's incentives cost them to do. My proposal, and as far as governance perspective, and it's Whitney's implementation and process proposal, but what I'm saying is that I think we need something more for us as a project to be able to evolve our APIs and to give us some guardrails for what we are and aren't going to put out there as the way to go about doing things.
All right, so in the channel proposal, right, is do or do not install some CRDs, right, basically. What
Yes,
would
by default,
not
by default,
only
you get extended.
Yes. John, does that alleviate your concern about choice? That by default, basically the unstable APIs are also being installed?
I mean, in kind of like it is a bit of a. I mean, it can be presented either way. Like, we could expose it as you incrementally opt into this enforcement, but technically you're not adding something, you're kind of modifying it, which is maybe fine. Like, I don't know why, to me that feels different and worse, but it's probably not in reality. It's kind of a hidden detail of how it's implemented.
Well, I mean, we're always going to have, right? Like, I think we're signing up for at least some form of validating admission or status down, like, long term, right? Like, per field. Like, I don't see how we dodge that bullet.
Right. I guess it's just a matter of whether that's added on top or by mutating the CRD. Like, even in Gateway API, for example, the problems they're having with this promotion is largely around what is the path from going from experimental APIs to stable. And that seems to not be clearly defined. But going from having no policy to having policy, that's a clearly defined problem. And I don't know all the details around it, but a lot of them even have like dry runs. Like, once you're past the policy, then you're locked in, and it's only, you can't make additional violations. Like, it's quite a different story than with CRDs, where you just apply it and then it wipes out all the fields, for example. And you have all sorts of kind of strange issues with storage versions and things like that.
I was going to mention that one distinction with Whitney's proposal is that it serves alpha versions in the stable channel, whereas Gateway API didn't want to do that. So that is one distinction.
So I'm going to have to drop here pretty soon as the Eclipse festivities are starting to kick off. I wanted to propose that, since Whitney's proposal has been bouncing around for quite a while, and it really does seem like it's time for us to either move or not on it, perhaps we should have TOC meetings weekly until we're able to come to a firm resolution on this. I feel like I lose a lot of context between meetings and end up having to rebuild it with you all, which I apologize for.
Well, maybe we should schedule a dedicated meeting for this. I have to admit, it's been quite a while since I looked at the proposal, so I'm trying to skim it in the background here while I'm paging in everything that's happened since the proposal was initially written. I guess that has to be this week, based on what John just said.
Yeah, Mitch, the code freeze is next Monday, so if we are to get this in 22, we ought to get a direction quickly. I mean, we can do things a bit after that, but for big sweeping API things, earlier is much better. So,
okay, that sounds good. I'll watch the calendar and the channel for updates on when that's going to be. I'm going to drop out. We'll see you guys later.
Okay.
I know we're way over time, but I do just want to point out last two items. One, I put up a PR just to review offline.
Sorry.
And the other thing is Gamma was officially promoted to stable in the Gateway API last week. So that is good news for us. So, I put on our docs I don't remember if it's open PR or if it got merged, but we should probably discuss it. Our stability level is beta specifically because we don't actually pass the conformance test for it. But we can go debate how we expose that probably offline since we're way over time here. But certainly in 1.22, we should probably make some noise about this in our release blog and things like that. So,
did you post in the 122 release chat just so release managers know that we want to? I think is it release managers who do that and queue up blog posts and docs and stuff?
Yeah, like they'll usually like put up a blank PR and then people can go fill in the stuff on the announcement. If we want to do a dedicated blog, then we'll have to do that as well at a band, which is probably worthwhile. I don't know. We should figure it out because 1.22 is actually a giant release in terms of things. There's all the API stability, there's ambient, and there's gateway API. So we need to have some coordination between those. So maybe let's follow up. I can bring in the usual suspects there.
Yeah, I think 3 blog posts are probably warranted with as many things are being announced, and then the announcement can leak out to those potentially.
Yeah, I'll start a thread in the docs channel.
Awesome, sounds good.
John, do we want to talk about the stability of L7? Well, that's coming. Speaking of ambient.
Sure.
So if folks haven't noticed, a lot of progress has been made on the L7 feature set in ambient as well as the API support. It's a little hard to know exactly, but if that rate of progress keeps up, L7 might be as stable as L4. Or at least, for some well-defined feature set, that's probably quite broad. So we might actually have the dilemma of deciding whether to call L7 stable or not in 122, which would be a nice problem to have. I guess the TOC will just have to kind of keep an eye on that, and we'll have branch cut and then patches, and we'll be doing testing. But it's a non-trivial possibility at this point. Obviously, big thanks to everybody who's been grinding away on those things. But so at some point we're going to have this question to decide. And we're going to need to communicate that to steering because they're going to do all the marketing around it. But yeah, that might actually happen. John, is there anything you want to add? Like the big key here will be testing, right? And how much testing, we obviously continue testing after we branch cut and we add tests and things like that. But it's something that people should keep in the back of their mind. You want to add anything to that, John?
No, I would say the same. Like we should probably figure out our intent like next week or something, and then maybe we ramp up the testing, and then like 2 weeks out. So after next week, there's like 4 weeks of freeze. So maybe halfway through that, we make a go no go decision based on how the testing's going. Then that gives us time to do all the publicity and whatnot. Seem reasonable. It's going pretty well, I think, now, but things could come up once we get to testing it more broadly. We've gotten actually pretty good adoption in the past of ambient of different platforms, and people testing it in weird ways we didn't expect. So unlike some smaller features where we say like, hey, let's go test it, and everyone go test, and we never find any bugs, I expect that we'll actually weed out any issues in that kind of pre-release phase. So then we can make an accurate decision.
Putting my steering hat on, I'm probably going to be voting more aggressively to get it out there if we're somewhat comfortable with the level of testing for L7. Mainly because with a massive new feature like this, the tendency is typically to wait a release anyway on the part of users. So I think that gives us some breathing room. If we can feel like we're not impugning the integrity of the project by saying that L7 is stable, even if it's a bit of a stretch, I probably vote more towards doing that from a steering perspective. But again, like I think John's plan is solid of let's see where we are next week, and then 2 weeks from the release, make a go no go decision. I'm good with that.
Yeah, so one of the bigger challenges that we need to spend a little time on in this is documentation. How much documentation? So, how much documentation do we need for L7 stability and just the ambient in general, like what the UX is right around documentation? You know, we can. There are a couple of different kind of information architecture approaches we can take in docs. Obviously, ambient does different things, supports different things. Those how it's different than sidecar needs to be documented. And we can either do a kind of a more monolithic kind of mono site for ambient, whether it's kind of self-contained navigation, or it's sprinkled through every existing doc that we have, right, as a toggle or something like that, right, to see different flavors in different tasks and reference and everything else. I suspect the latter form will be very hard for users to absorb. Versus even if it wasn't as complete, a more constrained set of documents that were entirely focused on the ambient use case. And then the only kind of other docs that we have are the reference docs for APIs, and they do have the toggle. And even that might be kind of painful, depending. Yes, so I'd like folks to think about that a little bit. It's something that we're going to need to get the ball rolling on as well. Obviously, it's not tied to the branch code. But that's the other, like, aside from like everything working and passing tests, that's the only other thing that kind of has me somewhat concerned. But that can be dealt with asynchronously to the release, so we have some flexibility there. Yeah, so think about how you want users to experience ambient from a documentation standpoint.
I have opinions, but they can wait since we're about 15 minutes over time.
Okay, well, start dumping them in the TOC and steering channel. That's probably the best place to put them. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now because we are way over.